Hi, Ben here, and a few days ago I got to see the movie that is being hailed a masterpiece, being hailed a triumph. It is The Brutalist, and I got the chance to see this at my local theater, and I went in thinking this is going to be one of the best movies of 2024. You hear so much hype around it, you hear about what this movie is. This is a movie that I believed would play very well to my senses, so it was very easy to get caught up in the hype surrounding this movie. And I left, and my reaction to this movie, which is what we're going to be discussing today, was that's a lot of movie, and I don't always know if that's a good thing. And that doesn't mean that I have all negative things to say, but that is to say that I do have a lot of negative thoughts on this movie, and I cannot deny the achievement that is The Brutalist. I will never try denying that. I didn't fully care about what I was watching, and I think that's a troubling idea when talking about The Brutalist. For The Brutalist, there is what this movie is about versus what it achieves at saying about America, and I think those are two very separate ideas that are easily confounded together in talking about The Brutalist. And also specifically, what this movie is about is it's about the creator of this movie, the director, the artist, Brady Corbet. And I want to say before I go into my review, take a second and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me grow and helps me see these movies early. But what is The Brutalist about? And I wrote down a few key ideas that I believe this movie is about when I'm trying to investigate The Brutalist. And essentially, there's some big ideas about this movie, specifically artistry as supported through capitalist endeavors and the relationships that, while unsavory, are required to be an artist. That is a big idea about The Brutalist. There is also a big discussion in this movie about Jewish dislocation post the Holocaust and World War II and the need to build a safe haven known as Israel. Essentially, the creation, the architectural design of Israel in many ways is a theme. This movie is about the erecting of monuments or communities, and Israel is a prime example for that. And then we have the lies of the American dream and how it spits out immigrants after exploiting them, as immigrants must either assimilate to be tolerated by Americans or refuse and be despised by Americans. Finally, this movie is, simply put, about a great man building his masterpiece. And that might be an apt metaphor for the director. And that's where I want to just start this review on. What this movie is about versus the principles that it stands for as a piece of art worthy of examination. And in this case of The Brutalist, it is the studio campaigning. It is Brady Corbet telling us what this movie is. This idea that it is momentous, this idea that it's a masterpiece, that's a triumph. It is an artist autonomy, a final cut for the director. It is a celebration in many ways of making the film as Corbet envisioned versus the norms of which Hollywood operates. And that can include many different components of it. That is the dictation of filming techniques. Maybe some of you who have been following The Brutalist have been hearing that this movie was shot on 35mm vista vision, which represents a way of filmmaking that used to happen, that doesn't happen anymore. That's not a common practice in Hollywood. And it also represents the period of time of which The Brutalist takes place in to try to recapture a certain feeling. It is also a movie that is very long, and we'll talk about that length and the use of an intermission in this movie. And it's also, quite simply put, the story that the director chose to tell. He wrote this script about 7 years ago, and now he has the opportunity to make the film without seemingly any compromise. This is the vision that he always had for a film. And I recognize that this is something that the studio of A24 is putting out into the Ethernet to essentially campaign for their film to win a Best Picture nomination. And I also understand that there's a lot of earnestness in this. I think Brady Corbet, everything that I've seen from him, he seems like an earnest filmmaker. I don't really question his want to do any of this stuff. I think he is legitimate in his beliefs and his vision. And in talking about The Brutalist, it is important to talk about the awards contention of the moment that it exists in, because yes, this is a movie, and this is also a movie that is going up for a lot of awards and is being presented to audiences like that. So yes, there is the earnestness of an artist and there is the pull of a studio trying to prop this up. And it's actually quite interesting, the parallels that we see to this within the film The Brutalist, which is a film that explores the relationship between artists versus commerce, and maybe that cynicality between those two. And, you know, essentially how an artist can envision something and how the studio, in this case, can envision something, and how maybe they both are intertwined and maybe they both have a same bottom line, and maybe the artist is willing to compromise more than he's willing to do. We see that in The Brutalist. So there is a fascinating exploration to be had about the commerciality within The Brutalist. But that's a long-winded way for me to say that this movie has a lot of ideas, and it has a lot of ideas specifically about art. I want to really emphasize that this movie is about art. And I can find enthusiasm about the achievement of which Brady Corbet is telling us is there and that the studio is propping up. But that act of achievement, which I will acknowledge is an achievement, doesn't dictate my critical thoughts about The Brutalist. And my thesis on The Brutalist, as I have it written down here, this is a movie signaling to its audience that it is momentous, yet it is unable to communicate why. Thus, must remind its audience that it is grand in scope and scale. That's how I felt watching this 3-hour and 40-minute movie. And that's where I want to just start with this idea, but this key word here in what is a masterpiece and a movie about a masterpiece. And we follow this character, Laszlo, played by Adrian Brody. And this movie is essentially in many ways him creating his masterpiece. And I think you can even expand on that further. And this is in many ways Brady Corbet building his masterpiece and what that means. And this movie has a lot of artists creating their masterpiece / legacy. Like, that is really the idea of this movie. And some words that I wrote down for that: it's grand in scale, it's ambitious, what they must endure to achieve, and what they must sacrifice. Those are all principal understandings of the Laszlo characters, what he is trying to achieve, what he must give up, the push, the pull, the tug. Yes, this movie is about a brutalist architect erecting his masterpiece. It is also a thinly veiled metaphor for the artist filming his masterpiece. I think you can take a lot of ideas about Brady Corbet through what he is achieving through this film and what he is trying to say about himself as an artist. And this movie, and I specifically felt that the director is self-conscious about that fact. I personally thought while watching The Brutalist that Brady Corbet didn't want us to think that. He didn't want us to be like, well, I'm just a stand-in for Laszlo. And maybe I'm wrong in that. Maybe he is more acknowledging of that than I was presented watching the movie. But in his self-consciousness, I felt that he creates distance from the screen. And what I believe that The Brutalist is trying to say about that is what a lot of artists have to experience: the unsavory people that they meet in order to finance their arts. And I mean, Hollywood is littered with this. Think of Harvey Weinstein. Think of the people that you do business with, these producers, these talent agents, all the pariahs within Hollywood that have made Hollywood Hollywood are represented in some way in this movie through the capitalist that is Guy Pearce's character. But before we go any further, I just want to give a brief synopsis for The Brutalist. And I'm not going to get into any real spoilers in this discussion, but The Brutalist follows Laszlo, a Hungarian Jewish architect displaced post the Holocaust who immigrates to America without his family and meets an industrialist, Harrison Lee Van Buren, played by Guy Pearce, who offers him a job to build a grand project. That is the story outline of The Brutalist. And I want to focus on this Laszlo character for a second, because I had some struggles with this character. And why this movie, I think, failed to resonate me is what this movie is saying through the Laszlo character. I felt like all of his emotions are at the forefront. Thus, when this movie steps away, when it detaches in many ways, and where it's trying to detach the artist, I felt that was a betrayal of the character of Laszlo, who wears his emotions in many ways on his sleeve in this movie. And I believe Laszlo and Brady Corbet are one in the same. And I think that's the tension that Brady Corbet as a director is having. I think he's self-conscious of that watching the movie. So artificially, it creates distance in his filmmaking in The Brutalist. Like I said, I thought this movie had a wall while watching this where I just couldn't penetrate it. And I was impressed by the style. I was impressed by the filmmaking of it, but I wasn't being grabbed. I wasn't feeling the emotion of this movie. And I want to make it clear just real quick. I don't think The Brutalist is bad. I know I sound very negative on The Brutalist right now. I am not necessarily negative on this movie. I think there is a lot of brilliance in this movie. I just didn't find this movie provocative in a way that I thought it was going to be. And I think primarily the reason I didn't find it provocative was this focus between the artist and the financier. I just didn't find what the director had to say about this to be all that compelling. The focus of this is simply that some people you meet to finance your art are very unsavory people, but you kind of just have to get through it to find financing for the thing that you feel put on this earth to do. I thought there should have been more nuance to this. I thought there should have been more discussion of it. And I didn't find that idea to be particularly engaging in this nearly 4-hour runtime because the Adrian Brody character never really grapples with that idea until a very specific scene happens that leaves him traumatized. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is to say, hey, the artist is so full of hubris in many ways that he's willing to ignore / put aside the unsavory moments of it. I just felt that there is a disconnect of what Adrian Brody's character is supposed to be feeling until he starts really being racked with this trauma that boils over in the second half of the movie. And I want to also just state, this is not a dig on the Guy Pearce performance. I legitimately think he is fantastic in The Brutalist. He might give my favorite performance in this movie. He is the man that makes dreams come true, but he himself has no artistic endeavors. He has no visions of grandeur. There is a very clear introduction of this character where he's a raging lunatic and he's so dismissive of the Adrian Brody character. And then when people tell him, oh, you're a genius, this architect did for you is genius, then he's like, oh yeah, I really need to use this guy because he gives me what I want, which is the statue of power. In the second half of this film, that is where we see the Guy Pearce performance really transform, and we see the cruelty and exploitation that comes within industry and capitalism, which that is where the artist comes in. And now I want to focus on the Adrian Brody performance of this, who I think Brody is really good. I think Brody is a very talented actor. Admittedly, I didn't feel engrossed in his character. And again, maybe this is just the disconnect I'm talking about that I was feeling throughout The Brutalist. That distance I was talking about earlier, there's just a lot of awful stuff that happens to him in his life. And yet for the most part, I kind of kept forgetting about it while watching this movie. Specifically, one that I'll point to that I don't think is a real spoiler is we're introduced to this character early on and he starts developing a heroin problem. And that's introduced, and to be honest, I kind of forgot about it until the second half of the movie, where the film kind of reminds you that he's a heroin addict. There is a lot of ideas of characters not being fleshed out that I think plagues the second half of the movie. And you've probably been hearing some reviews of this movie where a lot of the criticisms are happening towards the second half. I have to agree. I think the second half has a lot of just mess in it and a lot of unfinished ideas or half-baked ideas. And it certainly has the worst elements of this movie. And I just have to get to it. Felicity Jones is in this movie, and she's really bad in this movie. She plays Brody's wife in this movie. And I'm not going to spoil really much about what makes her performance specifically bad, but I will say she comes into the film in the second half, and I thought her and the niece character played by Rafe Cassidy, they were so poorly written. I do think Felicity Jones just kind of falls into the wife character of the great man, and in many ways she's neglected. Now, I will say Felicity Jones gets a great moment near the end of the film, and I think that is the standout moment of her performance, but there's just a lot of moments where I just felt like she was there in service to almost see the crippling downfall that her husband was experiencing from the stress of this project. I appreciated the artistic decision and what the Felicity Jones character and what the Adrian Brody character and what the niece, what this movie is trying to explore, especially to put it quite bluntly, immigrants getting fucked by exploitations of the rich. I think that is a really literal way to put it in this movie. And to be honest, the movie puts that in a quite literal way a few times. And there is an argument to be made that there are scenes in this movie where the metaphor is too obvious. And I would argue the metaphor is in many ways maybe too obvious. And maybe that's my own problem. Maybe that's my own misconceptions with the movie. But I just thought that this movie didn't have anything fresh or original to say. I don't think that this movie has nothing to say. I don't think that this movie isn't curious about any ideas. I just didn't think that it communicated any of those ideas in a way that I found compelling. It does feel like it is capturing the scope of such American masterpieces like The Godfather, like There Will Be Blood. Like, those have been movies that have been thrown around as comparisons of them. And I understand the reasoning and logic to do that. I think this movie exists very much in that same cloth. Like, I understand where that is coming from. I think what The Brutalist lacks is the intimacy of those other movies. I didn't really care about the Laszlo character in this film besides the basic human empathy aspect of it. Like, there is human empathy to be had for these characters, and that's what works. But I didn't feel like I understood any of these characters by the end. The achievement of this movie is getting this movie made the way that he wants it to be made. And I do think there are some brilliant choices in this movie. Let's talk about the big one, which is the run length of this movie. At 215 minutes, this movie is 3 hours and 45 minutes. And the movie cuts itself very brilliantly in many ways. And this movie has a 15-minute intermission, which breaks the movie perfectly in 100-minute halves. So you get 100 minutes, 15 minutes, and then 100 minutes. And I thought this actually worked really well to the advantage of the movie. And I actually think this is something where I really want to compliment the filmmakers and the writers of this film, is the tonal shift / pacing changes dramatically in the second half. So this intermission leaves you at a moment. It lets you digest a lot of the big ideas of this movie. And then the second half in many ways reverts / changes / plays with what our expectations of what this movie could be. This movie is never boring. I want to give it some, just a praise for that. I do think this movie moves at a really healthy, enjoyable pace. I never thought while watching this movie that I'm like, this feels like a nearly 4-hour movie. Like, this movie moves in a way that I was never bored. I never really found myself sitting there like, okay, this is a drag. Like, that is a really hard thing to do for a film, especially one for me where I wasn't even fully engaged. Me not being fully clicked and locked into the movie, I still didn't feel the runtime of 3 hours and 40 minutes. This movie could have been longer. This movie could have been shorter. And I still think the issues that I had with this movie would still be the same. And I wanted to focus on another idea present within this movie that I think may be a gripe that some people have that I want to just address, and I want to maybe in some ways fight it. There is a really big idea of this movie about Jewish dislocation post the Holocaust and the need to build a safe haven known as Israel. The Jewish story post World War II, if you want it. This is in many ways the framing device of the Brutalists. And what we have here in America versus what we can build for ourselves in Israel. That is a core tenet of this movie. Build to assimilate versus build towards freedom. And some people are going to take that idea and see where this film comes to its conclusion and its finale, and they're going to label this movie Zionist propaganda. I want to just address it because I know it's already becoming a topic of discussion with the Brutalist. I don't think that this movie is that, and I don't think that this movie is really about that. Rather, I think that the director is trying to meet people at the moment of which they existed in at that time and what transpires post-World War II. And I think it cleverly handles the ideas of America and an Israel being so closely tied and how one built the other and how Jewish people never really had a safety in America despite coming over towards America. And there's these ideas of assimilation in the culture. That is to say that In this movie, Israel is only mentioned in passing, and the finale deals with a near contemporary look at Israel. And I don't think that's a spoiler for the movie, but I won't go into any more details than that. I will just say that I understand why someone would watch this ending and draw the wrong conclusions on this movie, and maybe even find it a bit ham-fisted interpretation of propaganda for the state of Israel. I don't think that is the case. I think that this movie has far more nuance to that perception of the film. That does all come down to say, though, is I don't think this movie really fleshes out a great grand idea at all. I just found this movie in many ways derivative. It has nothing to say about art and the artist, except while the artists may be full of themselves, they are the victims and their approach is the right way. And we see this in many ways, even in the way that Corbet accepted his Golden Globe, where he says, final cut, tiebreak goes to the director. This is Brady Corbet's movie in full. And maybe that's my issue with the movie. It's just simply like, I am glad that he got to make this achievement. I am glad that he got to make the movie that he wanted to make. And if I can't buy into the sensibility of the director for this 3-hour and 45-minute movie, then I end up feeling a little lost by the movie. And that's kind of how I felt about The Brutalist. Ultimately, I think this is a good movie that believes it to be a great movie and is telling the audience, that is programming to the audience, that they are indeed a great film based on everything that it took to make a film. Ultimately, I think The Brutalist is a good movie. It just never came close to great for me. So maybe this is a surprise to people. I'm kind of shocked about it. I'm giving The Brutalist 3 out of 5 stars. So thank you so much for watching. Let's see how controversial this review is, or if some of you felt the same way about this movie that I did, let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more.